All right. So I want to welcome everyone to Champlain United Nations Association's first event celebrating Death of 3 months, a discussion on race and religion. We have two speakers with us now, and we'll have a little bit later. We'll go ahead and let them introduce themselves now. We have Rabbi Jan Salzman beginning first.
Hi, welcome. I'm Rabbi Jan Salzman, and I live in Burlington, Vermont, where I have a synagogue that I began in 2016. And it's identified with the Jewish Renewal Movement, which is a contemporary movement of Jews. And I'm honored to be here. And let's see, I've been living in Vermont for over 40 years. And so welcome from the state that's about to get hit with over a foot of snow.
Dr. Weaver, go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll get going.
Hello, I'm Steve Weaver, and it's an honor to be with you. Thank you for the invitation. And I am in Frankfort, Kentucky, which Frankfort is actually the capital city of Kentucky. And I have served here at a Baptist church, Southern Baptist Church, believe it or not. And I'm sure you've heard of us. We're not especially known for our being progressive on the race issue, which is some of what I'll talk about in a few moments. But I'm thankful for the opportunity to be with you this evening. And like I said, I've been serving here in Frankfort for 13 years as a pastor. And I also do some adjunct church history teaching, and I have a PhD in church history. And then I also serve at our state capitol as a kind of a chaplain. The title that I have is state minister. It's a volunteer, not paid official position, but it's I have Bible studies and do prayer support, counseling with people who work legislator, staff, governor's office, and others in the state capitol.
Awesome. So, Rabbi Jan, if you want to get started.
Well, to tell you the truth, I need a leading question because the information is vast. And so I want to hear where the question that you're asking is coming from, and I can, find my way into an answer. So what is it you would like me to consider?
Well, as this event is part of our series in Black History Month, but we're also taking this opportunity to showcase the Sustainable Development Goal of reduced inequalities. I suppose we have two questions for you as our current Jewish expert, I guess I would say. I guess our first question would be a little bit more general, where does racial justice sit in the Jewish religious community? What does that exactly mean for the Jewish community? And I guess in particular, as the Jewish culture is sort of unique in that it is both a race and a culture, what does that mean for Jewish inequality, for Judaism as a minority, and what does that mean for communicating and working with other communities outside of Judaism? I think you're muted there.
Okay, there you go. Well, I'll do my best to address these questions, and I'm not sure I understood the second one so much, but so so Judaism, of course, it has one of the most foundational texts about a people being enslaved and birthing out across the Sea of Reeds. So for those of you who are familiar with the biblical story, at the end of the book of Genesis, Yosef, whose name means to increase, to become abundant, he and his family end up in Egypt because of a drought. And the next scene opens in the book of Exodus, of Shemot, where the Pharaoh, the Paro, is becoming increasingly agitated about the presence of all these slaves, because by now they're slaves, and devises a scheme to oppress them more, and then Moses is born. So you're all familiar with that story. And if you aren't, you probably want to become so, because it's one of the foundational archetypes of oppression, the word and liberation, but not just liberation, but liberation on their way to becoming a whole nation. So in fact, this week's Torah portion is about that moment, Mount Sinai, the first download of the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances, not a commandment in it. Anyway, so the experience of having been a community which so that's a foundational myth, a mythic way of thinking, and then to have been a people who since 586 BCE were displaced from their cultic center, the temples. We begin to become a people that is always moving around and being and just about always on the lower tier of the social castes. And as time goes on, and we didn't have too much trouble with Islam in its beginning, but the Christians, the Catholics, we've suffered a lot. So there's a long way of saying that there is a historical relationship between people who are Jews and people of color when dealing with issues of slavery and of oppression and racial injustice, because our foundational myth is based on that journey. And so, Jews don't take the Hebrew Bible literally, right? And for all of you out who are hearing now, we don't call it the Old Testament anymore. It's the Hebrew Bible, because it's not supersessionist. We all share a lot of experiences, and we can take those experiences in that mythic sense, right? The story of Pharaoh and all that. And we also can look at it in a historical way. What has been our situation as Jews in the role of the oppressed? And what is it that kept us going over 2,500 years? I'm going to stop here and ask if there's any questions. I don't know whether there's a chat here or how do you want to, or comments?
There is a chat. There is also a raise hand function if anyone wants to speak a question out loud. If you want to use the chat, that's fine. I can have that read aloud for the purposes of the recording. I'll give people or a minute or so before I jump in there.
Okay. And as to your second question, I think the way I can answer that and make it in that segue is from what has just said about a historical position of being a minority, often in the position of being a minority in a place where the majority was out for our blood. That whole experience has led to, especially since the Enlightenment, when the 1700s, where the rational world, the philosophical world was really beginning to come into Judaism, although it had already come into it a little bit back in Greek times, but that's another conversation. The idea that you could reach out into the greater community, the interfaith community, and begin to expand, that brought us into more contact with oppressive tactics, and we were constantly being thrown under that wheel. So we got this one. And the question is, where are the similarities and how does it manifest in what our efforts to do now? So I'll end by saying that there's a concept in Judaism called tikkun olam, which means to heal the world, okay? And it these days is associated with acts of social justice. And social justice usually means delving into the world of racial injustice in a variety of ways, and always has. So the drive for tikkun olam, to heal the world, what's great now is that at least until the last couple of weeks, Jews are feeling very secure in the United States, albeit some very disturbing things have been happening actually over the last week. But the way that to be able to reach out in a deep interfaith web to address issues of racial injustice is something that we Jews have not had in a long, long time, the ability to reach out into the interfaith world. And so that is a real source of great hope and perseverance. So I think I'll stop right there, and other questions now, or we'll listen to Reverend Steve, or whatever you want to do.
We'll go ahead and let Dr. Steve go, and then we'll open it up to questions for both of you.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, well, again, I'll ask, like Rabbi Jan asked, how would you want to frame a question that will, I've got some things to say, but I'd like to address exactly what you would like to be addressed in this time.
I suppose we've certainly seen, and particularly in where you live further, which is far further south than Vermont, where most of us have seen religion being used as a tool to justify oppression, but we've also seen it used as a tool to raise up the oppressed. So I would say, how is religion used for both of these mutually incompatible, if they are mutually incompatible, goals, and how can we recognize when it is being used for somewhat nefarious purposes, I guess?
Okay, thank you, Kelsey. That's a very important question, as you know, and that's why you asked it. But it's one that we're dealing with, especially in our day, especially in the family of churches that I'm a part of, where we have a history. Where our history is actually tied to the preservation and defense of slavery, and in terms of its beginning. And that's something we've had to be very honest about and transparent about, and try to reject. The problem has been, though we have made some tremendous strides in addressing that from time to time, there's always a backlash. And we're seeing that, especially in the Southern Baptist Convention right now, we're seeing that backlash take place where some of the same things, and this is where I think I have a different perspective than a lot of my colleagues because of study of church history and American history, has helped me to see this, is that a lot of the same ways that religion has been used in the past, I'm talking about antebellum period, civil rights era, Jim Crow era, those exact same arguments keep resurfacing. And so if you're aware of, so right now in the group of churches that I'm a part of, there's a huge backlash against what is called critical race theory. I'm sure the students and all of you are aware of, and much much better than I am in terms of all the ins and outs of that particular philosophy. That's not the approach that I come from. I approach racial equality and tolerance and religious liberty and all those issues from a image of God perspective. We're all created in the image of God. We all have been, from a Christian perspective, purchased by the blood of Jesus Christ. So there's equality there that should be, the church should be leading the way in terms of stressing equality and turning against those forms of oppression. But instead, for some reason, the church has not done that really well. Okay, I'm speaking of the Protestant church, more particular evangelical, and even more specifically Southern Baptist. And what is happening now in terms of labeling critical race theory, because it has exposed some things about our own experience and our own use of religion in an oppressive way. A lot of the people in my denomination are pushing against it, labeling it as socialism, Marxism, and all kinds of isms. But then you go back and you read what Dr. King faced, and during the before the Civil War, and you see all of these kinds of things are. That's always been a way of labeling these things. I looked at someone like Frederick Douglass as an example of how he opposed the Christianity of the slaveholder. If you read his writings, you know he speaks of the. Uh, he doesn't reject Christianity, but he rejects the Christianity of the slaveholder. And there's some scholarly debate exactly how Douglas is using that. Is he using it rhetorically? Is he using it almost in a sense of appealing to the consciences of the people? He's certainly doing those things. I believe he actually still embraced historic Christianity while rejecting the Christianity of the, we put air quotes on it, the false Christianity of the slaveholders, because what they used religion in order to oppress, and that's what Douglas spoke out against. And so that's one of the things I've realized, that what I'm going to do, even though I would not, I'm not, uh, I'm approaching race and equality issues from a conservative Christian perspective. Like I said, people created in the image of God, an understanding of the gospel. Christians should have been leading the way on this. Unfortunately, we've had to be we've had to be informed by secular philosophy about what we've missed, where our blind spots have been. And what I want to do is learn humbly from that and say, okay, yeah, that's right. We've missed that. We need to correct that. Our solution may not be the same, but we see the exact same problem, and we're going to address this from a biblical issue. We should have seen it from a biblical perspective the whole time, and we should have been addressing it, but we didn't. Instead, what many people are doing is trying to have a backlash against the philosophy, and so the main big theme of today's topic is race and justice issues, right? And so where that comes down in terms of justice, and they're even though Southern Baptists for the last 25 years have said we believe in systemic injustice, we oppose it, and we want to oppose it, any form of it. Now there's a backlash even against that kind of terminology because it's associated with CRT, and and what I'm seeing in that is just a reactionary response and a preservation of the status quo, and a refusal really to be honest about the issues of race. And that's why you end up with things like happened now, I guess, are we about 3 weeks away from January 6th, where you have, uh, uh, what the best term for it is Christian nationalist, Trumpist uprising at the Capitol. And where does that kind of merging of those ideas of Christianity and white supremacy and American nationalism, where does that merging come from? It comes often from people like me and my colleagues not speaking clearly on these issues. And that goes from everywhere from conspiracy theories to white supremacy type issues to all kinds of issues, uh, that it's really easy for people like me to say, I'm just going to focus on the gospel. I'm just going to focus on the Bible. I'm going to focus on evangelizing and not be interested in those wider cultural issues. But whenever we're silent, something rises in that vacuum. And what has always risen in that vacuum historically has been those who would misuse and distort the truth for their own selfish purposes. And so that's what I'm trying to push back against in the context I'm in. And what I'm seeing is that whenever you speak about these issues, I mean, you can imagine in the mildest possible ways that you can mention race and these top issues, uh, there's an immediate backlash and a labeling and attack. I've been called all kinds of things. Whenever I am called those things, um, it hurts because I know I'm being misrepresented, but it also helps me identify with what people of color have experienced, uh, what Jewish people have experienced and do experience, what African American community has experienced, and other people of color have experienced uh, in that kind of a backlash. And I just decided some time ago that I'm going to accept that backlash. and I'm going to be identified with those who have historically been oppressed and on that side of things. And whenever I experience that, it lets me. And I know one thing, it's easy for me to feel sorry for myself, but in those responses, I realize that it's just such a microscopic amount of backlash that I've experienced compared to what other communities have been experiencing for decades, centuries, millennium, in the case of the Jewish people. And so it just reminds me again of how important it is. I don't want to be like, Dr. King in his letter um, from the Birmingham jail. He was addressing not evangelicals or even Southern Baptists. Sometimes we miss that when he's speaking to those mainline Protestant ministers. Um, they would have been much more progressive than the Southern Baptists. He's not even addressing them. They're not even on his radar because they're not involved. They wouldn't be on his side. They're the people yelling the hateful things, really, to be honest with you. But the Protestant mainline ministers he's addressing, they're urging patience and silence, and let's just let these things work out on their own. And what I know and what you know is that those things have never worked out on their own. There's always had to be people who have been able and willing to speak out on these issues and take that kind of backlash in order to see progress made in terms of religious liberty and in terms of racial equality. And so that's what, Dr. King said it so well in that letter that there was a time when the church was powerful. This quote, there was a time when the church was powerful, and it was like a thermos. Let me get this right. Sometimes, it's like a thermostat that did the temperature of the world, but it's become like a thermometer that simply reflects the culture. And in the South, religion is still like that, sadly. 11 a.m. on Sunday is still the most segregated hour in America, and it should not be. We're 60 years now since Dr. King said that, and it shouldn't be that way, but it still is that way. And part of why that is because as Christians pride themselves on being countercultural. We're countercultural in certain ways, but in on areas like this, we reflect the culture way too much, and we give in to our. I liken a lot of our ministers to being like a lot of the way our political leaders function. Whatever I'm going to go, we're going to listen. We're going to put our finger to the wind, and whatever the people are saying, that's the direction we're going to get out in front of and pretend like we're leading. And I think we need political leaders and religious leaders who are courageous based on conviction, who lead on these areas. And not, even, it's going to be costly because the constituencies, politically or religious, aren't always going to be there. I think that's what's called of us to be faithful.
Well, I want to throw in there that in the Hebrew Bible, it says 36 times that you shall love the stranger who lives in your midst. It's the most oft repeated phrase in the Hebrew Bible. And it becomes the foundation of what Hillel says, that Jesus said, just treat everybody like you want to be treated, which initially was a Talmudic rabbi who said that. But so it's hard for me, and I join you in your, I just want to appreciate how hard you're working, because it is hard to imagine how the message of the Hebrew Bible, which was how to create compassionate justice, and the Christian Bible that asks how can we bring love to the world. How is it that has gotten lost all these years? And it's there. So of course, we're all asking ourselves, what is it that would move a person along to have such a hardened heart like Pharaoh? Okay, so now we go back to the archetype. And the archetype, I was reminded while you were speaking that during times of slavery, the slave masters would tear out of the Hebrew Bible the book of Exodus, so that the Christianity that the slaves learned did not have the ability of a group of slaves to leave the slave master. That's astounding piece of history. And so the effort to reboot how people understand ancient words. So you asked a question, actually. When did Christianity begin to merge with the sword? And it was the Roman Empire. And when it's always fascinated to me that a group of people who were so devoted to love and to bring goodness and living in the world of, the words of Jesus, etc., get co-opted by the Roman Empire, which suddenly turns the word peace, pax, into meaning I win, you lose. And if you look at royal clothing over the next century and a half, what you notice is that little by little Christian symbols are being merged into the role of the king. So that by the time you have the British kings becoming, they suddenly have crosses on their scepters, they've now got crosses on top of their heads, and it's this incredible merging. How do you untie that tangle? How do you untie that tangle? And I have no answer other than perhaps what is it? I don't know how to reach the people who are hard, have their hearts hardened and hearted. And I think if we take the biblical story that we are in right now, the leaders were not happy about the Pharaoh. They were not happy about what was happening, but the people marched on and the people marched forward. So then they crossed the river, right? They're birthed out on the other side. And now they begin to grumble and it's just a disaster. The biblical story is a really hard story about how hard it is to change. And eventually we get to this point where after the golden calf, that the people who have known slavery will not be the ones to carry forward the freedom. That they had to shed the shackles of their minds and their hearts. And again, it's a biblical story. It's not historical. What is it about ourselves that we need to shed in order to go forward and do this important work? What are we bringing with us, and what is enslaving us? These are the questions that I ask when I'm wondering about how to change someone's mind. I come at it from a spiritual level. It's like, what are their tangles that are tying them all up inside, that are not allowing their hearts to open? And so the church and the synagogues have this assigned role in the community of being able to speak the language of the heart and that language of aspiration. What do we aspire to? What do we yearn to? And if things are going to change, it's because people's hearts are going to be changed, and then they can go forward like the mixed multitude to begin to find Torah at Mount Sinai. It's a metaphor here. So I really also just want to say again how I'm humbled and awed in the work that you do, because you are working in an environment that is not friendly to some of the ideas that we are discussing here. And I only hope, and I'm sure it's true, that you know where your source of strength is to help you through those hard times. So I wonder if there's some, so thank you for your story. I wonder if there's some questions that have come up from people, and that is. I see that, Carissa. Did she post the rest of her query?
Yes. She says, as someone who is neither of the religions you you practice, I wonder what aspect of your faith, culture, or history is most misunderstood and not appreciated by those who are not of your religion.
Do you want to begin, Steve, as I write
Sure.
my notes?
Yeah, I mean, just before I answer that, let me respond to Rabbi Salzman. Thank you for your kind words. And also, I just resonate with so much of what you said there. And so I appreciate you sharing. And I think one of the ways we appeal is through appealing to common understandings. And I think, Douglas did this, Dr. King did this. Religious prophets throughout history and throughout the Hebrew scriptures. I just preached from Joel yesterday, and in chapter 4 in the Hebrew Bible, chapter 3, ours, it says it actually addresses the devaluing of human life as a cause for God's judgment. When a boy is sold for the price of a night with a prostitute, and a girl for the price of a glass of wine. And so I address that issue of the devaluing of human life in all kinds of forms that takes place in our society today. And so that's one way to do it, is you have opportunity to address those type of issues uh, from something that we hold in common. So this kind of goes to Carissa's question: what is most misunderstood by those who are not a part of your religion? I think there's a lot of things that are misunderstood by those who are a part of our religion, and that's the kind of things that we've been talking about so far, and we want them to see that. For those outside, I think it's a little bit different. I would say for the Christian faith, it would be the concept of grace, because I think a lot of people outside of Christianity think of, and it's Christians' fault for this largely, but think that Christianity is about a list of do's and don'ts. It's about people who think that they're better than everyone else, and this is a club of uh, really good people. When in actuality, understand the New Testament. I'll use that term, sorry, but the Christian scriptures. Uh, if you understand those, the emphasis there is that we're all really messed up. Therefore, we need God's grace. And so the church is not actually a community of people who have it all together. It's actually a group of people who recognize how really messed up they are, how much they need God's grace. And we believe that's been provided to us through Jesus Christ. And so that's the central message of Christianity. And people, I think, realize that Jesus, obviously, cross, that's central to Christianity. But I think even still, it's really easy for people to think in terms of about what we try to do to earn God's favor, when in reality, what we're recognizing is that we've all fallen short and we need God's grace, and that's been given to us. So that would be my answer, Rabbi.
Thank you. Well, you opened, Kelsey, when we began, you called Judaism a race. And so one of the things that people misunderstand is that Judaism is not a race. We exist and always have existed, spreading out from the original core of folks out into the world, and have forever lived all over the world, have had all kinds of skin color, all kinds of eye shapes, all kinds of learning levels, etc. So we're not a race, we're a people. There's lots of other words that we can use. So that's the first thing to understand, because part of one of the foundations of anti-Semitism is that there's a race of Jews. Okay, so we can just deconstruct anti-Semitism by saying, how did that even begin? And the original thing that was misunderstood is that the Jews killed Jesus. Okay, we didn't. There's no evidence we did. That was a fabrication of the people who lived at that time, who needed a different story. And it has not gone well, certainly, both for us as a people and for the people who oppressed it. They kept their hearts hard, and that's no way to be a human being. So, so I think that would be, so those are two things that I think are misunderstood by people who do not know Jews. And it basically anything of the anti-Semitic tropes, right? That we control money and that there's an international organization of us and that we are trying to destroy the Palestinians or that, I mean, just or that we're the chosen people or list off the anti-Semitism, and those are the places that are misunderstood by the outside world. I want to build on what Steve said, is because I think there's a lot more, even amongst us Jews, we don't know anything about ourselves, right? So that the misunderstanding of what it is to be a Jew from inside that circle has undergone a cataclysmic and also evolutionary shift since the Enlightenment, right? Again, that's a very important time in Jewish modern history. So that the way I grew up, very secular, I had no idea that Judaism had all of these deep wells, wisdom, etc. I didn't know anything about it. And that's because my parents didn't continue it into the 60s and the 70s for their reasons, right? So a lot of people also lost people in the Holocaust, but you get it. So the misunderstanding, as Steve pointed out, is also an internal misunderstanding. And for all of our faith traditions are, they're part of the vernacular. They've been secularized. You only do them on one day a week, and there's a whole social history of how churches, mosques and synagogues are all being held in this like really narrow part of their mission statement, right? And there's so much more that we stand ready to contribute to the hard conversations. And so most Jews don't understand that the way they are, if they were raised by two Jews who were raised by, if they came from Jewish families, they don't understand how it is they are like that. They don't know anything about the rabbinic conversation that's been going on since 587 BCE, the Talmudic conversation about how do you deal with social change? What's the sieve through which you put social change so that we can always live in the places that we are? So the ability to encourage the world to take 24 hours off, Sabbath, whew, what a thought. Don't check your email for 24 hours. What? Amazing, right? And the other thing that I don't think Jews know about, or the other people, is that keeping kosher is a way that we sanctify the mundane. And so we sanctify food. So these are things that is an internal, that's the internal conversation. Who are we now, 150 years after the Enlightenment and 75 years after Germany and Poland and the World War II? Who are we now? And I think that in the Jewish world, there's been a lot of return to some of its more spiritual roots, and it's growing. It's growing a lot amongst young people who want more. Much of Judaism and Christianity became freeze-dried, and the words are freeze-dried, and we need to be pouring the hot water of our soul on those ancient words and bring them alive again. And that's what none of us knew about when we were growing up. So I'll stop here, but it's a very interesting question. Thank you very much. And I'm also paying attention to time, and I will pop off at about 10 minutes to 7, okay?
I think that you bringing up anti-Semitism works really well into my next question, which is the UN warns that we have seen a rise in anti-Semitism, not only in the US, but in the world at large. And we've seen very much in the US a rise in the last year or so of racism and racial tensions. Some say this is due to the pandemic, which is sort of like putting pressure on a leaky pipe, showing off cracks that were there for a long time and only exacerbating them. Do you think this is true? Do you think this is the same anti-Semitism and racism we've seen in the past, or is it evolving with the times in a negative way, I guess, if that makes sense?
Sure, sure. Well, first of all, I don't think COVID is the reason there's a rise in anti-Semitism. I think, without becoming political, that there have been people who've garnered the attention of the media that have spewed divisive, awful ideas. And so it's not so the COVID maybe got us to the burst pipe, but that's not where it comes from. That's not where it comes from. So of course it's deeply disturbing. Those of us whose parents or grandparents or great grandparents arrived in this country thinking that maybe this time we'd be safe, turns out that we aren't, and as a people. So you have to look at why our scapegoats created. And it usually has to do with people as individuals or groups of people who have a lot of barriers to seeing what their part of their own suffering is, and therefore project out onto another the very emotions that they need to be dealing with themselves. And so projection is the deepest impulse that human beings have when they don't want to take responsibility for their lives on whatever, whether it's an emotional or spiritual level, whatever, physical level. So the rise of anti-Semitism means that the narrative, again, that there is another group of people who is causing my problems, right, is a really dangerous one. And I think that we've all been unnerved. For those of you who are on this call who were unnerved by what happened on January 6th, it begins to really feel ever increasingly sketchy, to say the least. There's also, however, a real depth of ability to sit with the situation. And so what's going on in the Jewish world right now is, what are our antennae telling us? Do we all need to pick up and leave again? This is a very ancient response. It's not just 20th century. It's really ancient, okay? Where Jews would hide on Christmas and because otherwise the Christians were going to come and pull them apart. Just awful. So this is deep DNA kind of stuff, okay? So the question becomes, what are the signs? Is it getting too dangerous? We've seen attacks on synagogues, etc. So it's as a rabbi, what pains me is the history of projection. That the thing that I'm most being upset about, I'm going to take outside of me and project onto somebody else. Therefore, I can try to expunge it from my life. And there's a lot of violence in that kind of a thing. Whereas the Jewish tradition, actually, weirdly, and this is something that drives me nuts about, it's like we have a holiday called Tisha B'Av. That's on the 9th of the month of Av, and we sink into the deepest despair because it's the anniversary of the destruction of the temples, okay, ancient memory. And we repeat Lamentations. And Lamentations is, it was my fault the temple fell. It was our fault that the temple fell. It was our fault that the Romans kicked us out, the second temple fell. We have this deep tradition that says we have to examine what we might be doing to be bringing this suffering on our heads. We go deep into it in a variety of ways. So that's fascinating. Not because I think, of course, it wasn't our fault that Rome destroyed. There's nothing to do with our fault, right? But it's a deep psycho-spiritual practice that Jews have developed to ask the question, what was my part in my destruction? Okay, but not lash out at the other, because what that does is it dismantles my impulse for revenge. And Jews could never have an impulse for revenge, because if they did, they would have been slaughtered more. So you have to kind of ask that projection revenge thing. That's scary, because if you're not aware of what you're doing, you do some really awful things. And so I'll stop here. And sorry I spoke so much, but it's a very, as you can imagine, you asked me about, it's a kind of a deep subject. So Steve, I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I don't think that COVID caused it either, but I do think we kind of have a perfect storm with things that are going on politically, and then with all the issues related to COVID. We see. I'll just put it this way: you've got majority culture people who uh, who end up many times for the first time experiencing economic difficulties coming out of this. Um, Shut off from communities of faith, they feel like, in terms of not being able to gather. And it took, I mean, it's really shocking when you think about it, how it took about half of a millisecond uh, for, I'll say this since I are one, for white people to really not do well with any kind of suffering when they, where we struggle to understand people who have suffered for centuries, and it's just really bizarre in that sense. But I think the root of it is going along with what Rabbi Salzman said, is a xenophobia and a failure to actually know people who are different than us. We're so isolated in our communities, and that's getting worse and worse. I mean, not only do you have the algorithms that are on Facebook and Twitter and so forth that keep you only learning from news sources and people that are like you. Now we have people leaving Facebook and Twitter to go to even more isolated platforms, which is, I said, people say, "Are you going?" No, I'm not going. There's enough anarchy and hate speech on Twitter and Facebook for me. I don't need to go find another platform for that. Uh, so, there's it's it, we just we don't have those relationships, and we don't know someone who looks different than us and who thinks differently than us. Then it's very easy for us to demonize those people. And wherever you see people who are making progress in terms of racial relations or any other kind of relations, it's when they actually know people and are sitting down and having meals with, talking with, learning from. I just had the opportunity a couple of weeks ago to sit down with a Jewish rabbi in our community. And one of the things I want to know is like, okay, I'm really sensitive and I'm responding to issues in terms of uh, racial injustice that are impacting African Americans. I'm really thinking that way. But I think I realized, okay, I'm missing this in terms of there's a lot of anti Semitism that's underneath the radar, and sometimes I'll see, a news report here or there, but I haven't responded to it as well. And so I wanted to hear from him. What are some things that I need to be aware of? How can I learn, and how can I communicate better? There's certain core convictions I have, obviously, as a Christian uh, that I hold to, but I do not want to do things like the rabbi was talking about just a moment ago. The blaming of the Jews for the death of Jesus. There's a way in which Christians can talk about the crucifixion in a way that's anti-Semitic, and obviously that has had. I mean, you think about there's a long history of that, right? And in the Protestant tradition with Martin Luther, and then even more recently. So uh, those are things that we need to be aware of, and how we speak and how we communicate. Because if we've learned anything in even the last several weeks, is how important words are, and the words of leaders are so impactful, aren't they? And influential, and they can either build up and unite, or they can destroy and tear down. And again, we've lived through a history just very recently that demonstrates that. I think then puts the responsibility on leaders, even with much smaller microphones. with much smaller megaphones, but still speaking into communities, that we would use language that does not divide and incite violence. And sometimes we're unaware of how that language has been used. And so that's why we need to know and listen and have those conversations is, what am I doing? What am I saying? And my rabbi friend was very frank to share with me some issues that I could improve on, not me personally, but in Christians in general, and things I'm learning from and want to be sensitive about going forward. So it's having those relationships, knowing people, knowing how. Um, if I didn't have black friends to tell me uh, what it sounds like when white people talk about the good old days of the 1950s, uh, I had to hear that several years ago. I had to learn that because that meant from the people that I was hearing saying, I was thinking certain things. Um, I would never say anything like that now. I wouldn't say make America great again because that implies we want to get back to the days when America was great. And what we largely is meant by that, great for white people, white males, anyway.
Exactly.
And so
So
we,
Steve, I want to make sure you know that I have to get off, but I want to make sure you know that you and I can work together. And I think that one of the nicest things about this evening is I've just been introduced to Steve, which is great. And so I'm happy to be a resource for you and you for me, because that we need. It's good to check in with each other on these things. I'm sorry to leave, but I have to go to someone died, and that we do a memorial service every evening. And so I am going to go off and do that. Okay. So thank you so much.
nice to meet you.
Thank you
Nice
so
to meet
much for
you.
joining us.
Here's to more.
I have a question that's sort of specific to Christianity. We talked a little bit earlier about the relationship between white supremacy and Christianity, and how though that sort of arose from a miscommunication, a pretty big miscommunication, I want to say, between the message of Christianity and how it is translated to people who practice. How do you think we can begin to separate white supremacy from Christianity as a community?
I saw an article today, the title of it, I haven't read the article yet, but it's just like, why are there no white people in the Bible? Just that kind of a recognition, I think that would be very shocking to tell most white evangelical Christians that there are not any white people in the Bible. That would blow their minds uh, because, well, for obvious reasons. So what we need to do is, uh, teach that, emphasize that, say that, uh, and we can't just assume uh, that people understand these things. And and when we come across those issues, like I was talking about, I was preaching from Joel, the minor prophet Joel, and when there's issues that come up addressing issues of racial injustice or the devaluing of human life or the oppression, those kinds of issues. That's where I learned recently is just by reading. Uh, there's a African American scholar who teaches at a conservative evangelical school, but he wrote a book recently called "Reading." I think it's called "Reading the Bible While Black." He's writing it terms of his own experience and what he has experienced in time, trying to navigate um, the black church as well as the white evangelical world. And um, what I was able to learn from that is kind of like listening in on a conversation, but the way the black church has interpreted the Bible, they've gotten a lot of things a lot better, a lot more right, correct. than the white church has in terms of seeing those big themes. Some actually one of the themes that the rabbi was talking about a moment ago, in terms of just the deliverance, that motif, that big theme of the rescue from slavery and oppression, which is the major story of the Hebrew Bible. That's a big story, and 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 white evangelicals can suppress or ignore that. Just, I mean, almost as much as what you mentioned, the slaveholders pulling out the book of Exodus from the Bible because they didn't want their slaves to learn about this, that God was for the oppressed and for those enslaved, and actually rescued a nation of people that was in such a state. And I think we end up, we don't, may not tear the book out of the, we wouldn't tear the book out of the Bible, but um, we end up actually doing that. You know, we end up actually doing that by ignoring and downplaying those themes and only emphasizing certain themes that emphasize authority and submission, uh, while rejecting those themes that actually, or downplaying those themes that speak to oppression and racial equality. And so that's, I think, how we address that is by doing a better job of interpreting the Bible, uh, listening to other voices and see how other people are reading the Bible, and not just reading it from our perspective, but listening to those voices, like I was talking about, from the professor Esau McCaulley, who wrote the book Reading While Black. He gives that perspective of just with several vignettes into different portions of Scripture, how the Black church has read the Bible, and in some of those ways, the white church is just catching up to, in terms of, okay, yeah, oh, here's these big themes we've missed. Why did we miss them? Well, sometimes we miss them intentionally, and sometimes it was a huge blind spot. So, and yes, I am a Christian. I'm a pastor. Uh, so thanks for the question.
My next question kind of gets into some of the events that we've been seeing throughout the year in terms of police brutality at Black Lives Matter protests, and the sort of lack thereof when white people decided that they were going to storm the U.S. Capitol. Uh, what do you think the relationship is between Christianity, white supremacy, and police brutality?
I guess all these questions are for me now. Uh, okay, so, well, there's a way in which Christianity can be used and has been used to uphold structures. And there's certainly teaching in Scripture in terms of submission to governmental authorities. Um, and yet, there are ways of understanding, you know, the submission to authority that's called for in Scripture is for that kind of authority that is just and equitable. And so there's an implicit, even in those calls for submission. If you look at a text that's often used by Christians, Romans 13, in submission to authority, which is, you know, the one I would teach and understand, but uh, it actually implies or assumes or calls for a a pure justice being enacted by those who are actually in authority. And so that's one of the things, that's one of the chapters in the Macaulay book I was talking about, is how some of these key texts uh, that the evangelical church, for lack of a better term, uses simply to emphasize submit to police, are actually texts that help us understand what police should actually look like. And you see this also in the gospel accounts, and he does a good job with this as well, pointing out the role of the centurions and what that relationship. That's kind of like a modern day equivalent of police in terms of how they function in the ancient world, and that kind of relationship. So So in terms of what's the relationship between this for and noted, Kelsey, that when you think about in terms of um, the storming of the Capitol, blue lives didn't matter that much anymore, do they? So that's kind of it really exposes some of the hypocrisy of that kind of language that sometimes is used. There's sincere people who are using that language, but of Blue Lives Matter, certainly. But it also can be used simply as a cop out to really as a pushback against the phrase Black Lives Matter. And so when that happens, then you have kind of a blind, uncritical accepting and support for all forms of authority, even when it is shown to be abusive and a misuse of power. And sometimes scripture is used just in the same way that Christians use scripture to uphold slavery as a system. It can be used to uphold police injustice or brutality. And whenever that happens, it is a misuse and misinterpretation of scripture. And that, again, that's where I think that reading from other perspectives and learning from other perspectives is helpful, because it's not just white people who have read and interpreted and believed the Bible. There are communities, uh, of faith that are reading the Bible as well, and they're reading the same passages and sometimes getting quite different lessons from them. Uh, and so that's why I think it's good to have those relationships and be in conversation with one another, because those blind spots that any of us can have, we C.S. Lewis would speak about how that it's important to read, for every one new book you read, to read two old books. And he said the reason for that is because we tend to see things from our perspective from a certain point of view, and reading something from a previous century, those people had blind spots too. They weren't perfect. Their blind spots are more open and obvious to us, and we'll see them, but they'll help us see our own. And he said books from the future would do just as good, but we can't get to those yet. So we can't get the books of the future, we can't get books from the past. But I think that same lesson goes with, let's read from people who have different experiences. Let's learn, not just read, but learn from, in conversation, people who have different experiences from us. Because he said, in that expression, two heads are better than one, not because two people can't be wrong, but because two people are unlikely to be wrong in the exact same ways. And that's why we learn from one another.
Thank you. And our other final speaker has joined us. I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself, so I don't get any pronunciations or titles wrong. I'll give you the floor now.
Hi, can you hear me? Hello?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, hi, my name is Rabbi Eliyahu Junik. I'm a rabbi here in Chabad of Burlington, Vermont. I'm a Jewish organization here. Asked to speak in short notice, so I'll keep my comments brief. I actually loved what the last speaker, when I came on, said about for every new book you should read for old books. I love that. Just wanted to say, I don't know what was said before, but just a bit of a perspective of Judaism when it comes to race and inequality. Um, um, there are times when our perspective of things is very skewed and based on our experiences and what we read and what we see and what was given over to us from previous generations. Therefore, it says that it's always important that when we go back to the Torah, go back to the Bible that was given by God on Mount Sinai to really gain perspective on how to treat other humans. We find something very interesting, that a lot of the commandments of God are specific to specific people and specific times. But there's an interesting commandment at the beginning of the Torah that strikes a very interesting tone. It says, when it speaks about murder, it talks about not you shall not murder, and you shouldn't murder yourself, you shouldn't murder someone else. So the Torah there says, the Torah says like this, that because we were created in the image of God, therefore you shall not murder. And it's a very important reason. We don't murder not because it's not kind, not because it's wrong, not because other people will murder us if we murder them, but there's a certain equality between all humans. We were all created in the image of God. There is no difference in our humanity between one person and another. And therefore it says, you shall not murder. It says in Noach, it says, that's in Hebrew, because we were created in the image of God. And that is the reason why. We know that throughout our history, especially in the last 100 years, we always learn murder is wrong. And sometimes it's hard to fathom how someone could think that it's right. But 70 years ago, there was certain individuals led by an evil person named Hitler. He wrote a book, and he convinced plenty of people that murder is not wrong. That murder is wrong, but it depends when. It depends for who. It depends on your objective. It depends. If you're murdering to keep your race clean, then it's okay to murder. And specifically, we learned in the Torah that the reason we don't murder is not because it's bad to murder. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory, the leader of the Chabad movement, always used to stress that certain commandments is not enough to do them because they're bad, because we think they're bad. Ask someone, is it okay to murder? Everyone will tell you no. But that's not good enough. A person should not murder because God said no. Because God said that every individual was created in the image of God. That is the reason. Because if the reason is because it's not nice, it's not okay, it's wrong, right? Then human brains could always come with a reason why this case is different. We're very good at that. But keep it selam holy kim asas adam, because we were created in the image of God. There is no excuse. There is no difference. Everyone has that image. And it's not only when it comes to murder. I think the more we study this perspective, and the more we gain from the Torah how to really look at every human, that every human's created in the image of God. It goes to treating all humans the same. And sorry. And it's interesting to note that we're very used to, even though we consider murder wrong, we're very used to when we look at the newspaper, when we look at the news, and we always want to see, it says God forbid, there was an accident, something bad happened. We always look to see, so what type of person was it? Was it this type of person? That, let's say, was it Jewish? Was it white? Was it this? Was it Italian? We're always looking to box in what situation did this happen. And I think that itself comes from this bias that we have, that so to speak, we're more in the image than someone else. And we pray that we come to a time, as the Lubavitcher Rebbe once said to Mayor Dinkins. He was a mayor in New York. At the time, there was a lot of racial divide. The Rebbe said, and I quote, "In the near future, the melting pot of America will be so active that it will not be necessary to underline every time when speaking of others they are black, they are white, they are Hispanic, because they are no different. All of them are created by the same God and created for the same purpose, to add to all good things around them. And as when we look at things on our own sometimes and we have biases that we grew up with, it's always important to look at the Torah, how God's blueprint for humanity, and remember that all humans are the same. God created all of us the same with his image. No difference what color, what race, what religion. When someone passes, it's sad. Not because they look like us, not because they believe like us, and not because we come from the same continent. Ultimately, that's not what makes us human. What makes us human is the fact that we were created in the image of God. Thank you.
Thank you. I suppose I'll ask you a question that I asked our speakers earlier, but I'd like your perspective on it. Religion, of all different religions, of course, have been used to both oppress and to raise up the oppressed. And we, as you talked about with Germany, there is a certain amount of justifying that can be done for just about any action some person wants a group of people to take. And you talked about how if religion is followed properly, then you kind of avoid that because it's less about the changing of human minds and more about the following of God. How do you think that, because obviously that isn't always the case, we've seen it before, how do you think we can move towards that in the future? Getting a more, I guess to try and reword it, how we can try to refrain from using vague terminology like, oh, because it's wrong, or oh, because public opinion is against it at the time, to prevent the swaying of that opinion to the downfall of certain groups, if that makes sense.
Yeah, interesting question. Um, every religion is not just as good as the God of it is, but also as good as the humans that practice it. Humans are far from perfect, and therefore people have used religion for centuries to do wonderful things, and unfortunately sometimes not good things. I would say a few points. One point is that it's that when our perspective, just a bit of an anecdote. It's interesting that in the 1960s, crime went very high in New York City, as we know. The Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, in blessed memory, was once sitting with, I think, the Attorney General. He asked the Attorney General, why does he think crime went so high in New York City, 60s, 70s? Attorney General said that he doesn't know. So the Rebbe pointed out something, which I'll say phase one and I'll say phase two after that, that there's something else happened in the 60s that that caused a lot of the crime. Rebbe felt that caused the crime was that we know that prayers in school was banished in the 60s, early 60s. And the Rebbe felt very strongly that really the way to stop someone from stealing, stop someone from murdering, is not to put them in prison. The Rebbe actually once stressed that when you put someone in prison, obviously if they're violent, you have to control them. But in general, excessive prison takes away the image of God within that individual. It doesn't let them do what they need to do in this world. The Rebbe felt that if we would focus more on God, if there would be prayer in school, for example, or in the 80s, the Rebbe suggested, based on the fact that prayer became very controversial, that you have a moment of silence every morning when children are raised, not just to learn science and math, to be the best, to make the most money, not just use learn skills, learn tools, but to learn their purpose of their being. But when we would start off schools, when we would start off school with a moment of silence, we would start off school with contemplation about whatever a person wants to think about. But if a person thinks about that God created me, God created everyone, we're all equal, and we need to treat everyone as just, and God watches over us, and God knows what I do. If we go back to that basic, even without any particular religion, so to speak, but the fact that God created us and we're here to make humanity better, we were all created in the image of God. If we teach that to our children and to ourselves when we're young, so we give them a foundation, not just to make an atom bomb, but why we should have such great power, that we can use it for good, not for bad. Anything that we learn, math and science, could go both ways. We need to teach children from young and ourselves and really contemplate every single day about about the fact that we were created by God, the fact that God created us, the fact that we are created in His image, and how to better ourselves and how to better others. And we should not kill because you don't kill the image of God. You should not steal because you don't steal from the image of God. And 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 the person really needs to have this ingrained within themselves. It's not enough to say it once, and how we have to really contemplate it. And therefore, in the 80s, the Rebbe spoke tremendously about having this moment of silence where the teacher doesn't tell the children what to do, but every individual asks their parents what they should think about at that moment. And that gives the parents an opportunity to teach morality, to teach about God to the child, which is the most important way to keep our society as a whole. And to your point of that there's always a risk people use religion for slavery. If you were from the South, you spoke how the Bible's pro-slavery. If you're in the North, you spoke how the Bible's against slavery. Everyone could be subjective, but and humans, and the way to really overcome that is we need to so we need to study the Torah. We need to really contemplate about the fact that we are all created in the image of God, and if what our interpretations, our next interpretations, don't fit with that, or our biases don't fit with that, then they're wrong. And and I think it's a challenge, I would say, especially in these days when a lot of the students of middle school, of elementary school, are really not brought up with any higher system. Maimonides, the famed Jewish philosopher, wrote that it's not enough to do the 7 universal laws that God gave to the whole of humanity, otherwise known as the 7 Nohad laws. It's not enough to do them because it's bad things to do. For example, stealing, murder, etc. We should not do them because God told us not to do it. God is watching over us. God created the world. God gave us a purpose. But only then we can take away our biases. Humans are faulty beings. We need to go out of ourselves and connect more to God and connect to this idea that God created us. God watches over us, and God created all of us with the same image, and we may not extinguish an image of God within someone else, just as we may not distinguish within ourselves, no matter what race, religion, ethnicity, and there's really no difference because the image of God is equal in everyone.
Thank you. That was really very informative about the Jewish faith. I think I'll kind of end with a question for both of you. Racial inequality is a religious issue and a secular one. It affects all of us equally. How can the two circles, and indeed the circles within those circles, work together in order to fight it in this country and globally?
You want me to go first or wait for the rabbi?
Yeah, you could go first. Yeah.
Rabbi, do you know Rabbi Shlomo Litvin in Kentucky?
Homo Litvin. The name
Litvin.
sounds.
He's he has the Chabad of the Bluegrass at University of Kentucky, and he has the same picture, I believe, that's behind you in his office. I just met with him a few days ago in his office, and he pointed him. He was out back near. He was near the back. He
You
showed me
want
where
to
he was, but I had to take his word for it. But
you want to play a game to find me there?
yeah, I believe you guys are connected in the same
Yeah.
organization. Is probably not the right word, but I believe that's. I just
Yeah.
messaged him to see if he knew you, but I haven't heard back yet. But anyway,
Yeah. I've heard his name before. There's a lot of us, so hard to
yeah,
know. Yeah.
several of you in that picture. So that's yeah. He was telling me about how that whole emissary work got started. So that's very fascinating. So
Yeah.
thanks for the work you're doing there. Anyway, I just want to make that connection real quick. But sorry, Kelsey. Uh, so yes, to your question, I think like you said it impacts secular and religious. And one of the benefits we have in this country is this idea of religious liberty. And I think what that allows us to do, and I was talking to my Rabbi Litvin the other night about this, and we share this commitment in common, is, this we have a level playing field for each person to practice their faith, or we should, at least that's a constitutional idea. And uh, each one of us, in terms of religious liberty, should desire the other to have that liberty and be willing to stand by the side of one another and contend for that, even though we might have deep fundamental disagreements about our religion. Uh, we would still be very active in defending the right for each of us to believe and practice our religion. And so I think that same idea we could take in terms of race, in that we believe in this idea. There's a founding idea of America that America has not always lived up to, and it didn't from the beginning, and we still struggle with it. But it's that idea of all men created equal, and we're still working through that. And the best streams of American history have recognized uh, what that means for all of us to be, as the rabbi said, all of us made in the image of God. That's that ideal of creation that he was speaking of. Since we're all made in the image of God, therefore we have equality and dignity and worth as human beings. And that's something in the Hebrew scriptures, obviously foundationally, but it's also picked up in the Christian scriptures as well, based on those Hebrew scriptures. That when you lie to someone, you're lying to someone who's made in the image of God. That's why it's so serious. When you murder someone, you're murdering someone made in the image of God. Just like it would be a terrible thing for me to or for someone in my presence to deface a picture of my wife. That would be offensive. To attack the image is to attack the person. And so that kind of that understanding of the equality that we have, and even of course in this country we have not only those who have faith, but those who are of no faith, who also have equal protection and equal rights not to believe. And the rabbi and I would try to convince you, perhaps, uh, to believe, but we would recognize your right not to be prosecuted or persecuted by the state. And so that kind of equality and freedom that we have is something we need to recognize as a common playing ground, that all of us, whether whether we're part of the majority culture, part of the majority religion, part of the majority ethnicity, that we have a responsibility to one another. And from time to time, different groups find themselves being in power in terms of different contexts. And we have the opportunity, when it's us who are in those positions to not only make decisions that are for our benefit, but for the benefit of others, and especially the minority communities. So I'm done.
Do you have anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I think when it comes to, I think that we really, in America we have freedom to practice our religion as we see fit, and we need to use the opportunity, not just to practice for ourselves, but rather to inspire um, to inspire others, and to teach others really the truths that are written within the Torah, within the Bible, and obviously everyone has, and that's and this idea that I have freedom. Everyone has freedom to say, to believe whatever they want, and to practice how they see fit, or not to practice at all. But I think the fundamental thing is as it says, because we were created, as it says in the our founding fathers wrote, because all men were created equal. We were created equal, and therefore we have equal opportunity. And we were created equally in the image of God, and that goes to everyone. I have the right to speak. Everyone has the right to speak. But I think it's important, those that have an opportunity to talk, that the words matter, and we should always be teaching, not just, let's say, for the Jewish community, let's say in my case, but rather our message is universal. In the sense, it's not just that I was created or my congregation was created in the image of God, but everyone was created, and therefore I respect everyone's right to say what they please, etc., and to pray as they please. Um, and I think the foundation really is because we were all created equally in the image of God. And it's important not just to teach that to ourselves, but really to teach it to everyone else. It's a universal truth that God created the world and every human is important. We know they say that God did not create anything in vain. Every animal, every single thing in this world has a purpose and a reason, and it goes that especially human beings. Every single human being is unique in the sense of, if God has you already, he doesn't need you again. He created someone else because he created, every person has their uniqueness. Every person has their own individual uniqueness and image, and that needs to be respected and taught, I think, as a universal message, not just as a religious message, that we were all created in this image, and we all have a purpose, and we're all important before God. Because if God made you, and God wants you, God needs you for the creation, for this world, make this world a more peaceful and better place.
I think that's a great place to end it here. I want to thank you both for attending this discussion. I know it was a bit last minute. We did have to throw it together, but I think it was a really great discussion to have, and I really look forward to discussing it with my fellow companions, both at UNA and at the school further, because of course the discussion's not over. Thank you both so much, and I won't keep you on your Monday evening any more than I have to.
Thank you, Kelsey. You did a great job hosting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. You have an. I'll hit stop on the recording, and you can all